Thanks so much for joining us today for the Colorado Victim Advocate podcast, sponsored by Intervention, a Colorado-based nonprofit organization providing court services to multiple judicial districts here in the Centennial State. My name is Randy Saucedo, and I'm the Director of Victim Services here at Intervention and ICCS Community Corrections. Today, we're talking with Hope, a law enforcement-based victims advocate. I'd like to welcome you to the Colorado Victim Advocate podcast.
Thank you, Randy.
Now, of course, in full disclosure, Hope and I worked together at Commerce City PD many years ago. I like to say maybe back in the 1900s. And of course, she did an outstanding job there. And then she moved on to bigger and better things at a larger police agency. So we really appreciate having you here today, Hope.
Well, I'm excited to be here.
So, Hope, tell us a little bit about your work as a victim advocate at a police agency because, this podcast, we're trying to bring awareness, highlight what victims advocates do, but as you know, there's different advocates for different parts of the criminal justice system. And so I'd like you to just talk about the work that you do as an advocate.
As an advocate at a law enforcement agency, it's a little bit different than like a court advocate. We oftentimes go directly on scene with officers and do advocacy work. So we are often the very first contact that victims have with an advocate. So it's so important that we build that rapport and, meet the victim where they're at, because when they meet us, that can leave a lasting impression of victim advocates. So we always strive to really build that rapport and offer great support to them. When we go on scene, every call is a little bit different. So it depends on what type of call we're going on. Some of the common things that we do is assess safety and security. Not only our safety, but safety of the victims. So when we get there, we always make sure that there's a law enforcement officer on scene for our own safety. And then when we meet with our victims, we always make sure that they have a safe space where they can talk to us. And then what happens is we kind of find out what their needs are. So that can look different for every situation. For example, in domestic violence situations, we do a lot of safety planning with victims. We do a lot of emotional support. We want to make sure, because we leave at the end of that call, so we want to make sure that they have, when we leave, a safe plan in effect before we depart that scene. So we offer a lot of resources, community resources. We offer emotional support. We let them know that we will keep in contact, so they will always have someone to answer their questions. Oftentimes, we act as liaisons between victims and other departments. So we do a lot of collaboration, and a big part of our job, too, is victims' rights. That's probably one of the most important parts of our position. We want to make sure that they understand that they have rights and that we are going to uphold those rights and make sure that all through this process, those rights will be guaranteed to them and followed. We want to make sure.
What are some of those rights?
Some of those rights are to be informed if a person's taken into custody, if they're released, if they're transferred to another facility. They have a right to be treated with fairness, dignity, and respect. So just notifying them of all important stages. They also have a right, and we do a lot of this on scene as well, they have a right in some cases to financial assistance. So we oftentimes fill out what's called a crime victim compensation application, which helps them with things like getting their locks changed. If they have medical expenses, that happens a lot in crimes. They may have medical expenses that were related to the crime. So we help them fill out the paperwork so that they can get help with that.
So, not only do you respond to criminal activity, but you also would respond to other traumatic events.
Yes, we have a lot of like traffic accidents. Maybe someone seriously hurt. It's not always a criminal event.
And what would some of those other things be other than like a car crash or an accident or something like that? What would some of those other events be?
One time years ago, I had a traumatic event where somebody's dog was run over,
Okay.
and they had to rush it to the vet, and it died at the vet's office, unfortunately. But the person was very traumatized, and so our officers called me there to the vet's office to, talk to the person after this all happened and give them resources for counseling and just kind of help them through that whole emotional process.
And so whenever you're going on scene or other advocates are going on scene, let's go back to an actual criminal event that may have occurred. When you're in contact with those victims, what's going through the victim. How are you dealing specifically with the victim? I mean, what I'm asking is it depending on the situation, how is the victim acting when you show up to a scene?
So, keeping in mind that we are there in the moment of the crisis. So, this is fresh and raw. It's something that usually has just happened to them, maybe, half hour ago. So, we see a lot of heightened emotions. So, it's a lot of kind of calming them down and helping them through that before we even talk to them about any of the resources.
And I would presume that would be a very difficult spot to put in, especially if there's multiple people that you're talking to.
Yes, we go through a lot of training that helps us with crisis intervention. We go through a 40-hour training, so we learn a lot of those skills. And then we shadow people before we ever, go out on calls by ourselves. So there's a lot of training that goes into.
When you talked about the 40-hour training, is that something that, let's say, for instance, somebody listening to this, if they want to become a victim's advocate, is that something that they would have to do?
Yes. And I encourage, in our police department, we have a large group of volunteers.
Oh, good, good.
And they help us on the weekends, so that staff doesn't have to be available all the time. So they go through, and I went through a 40-hour training where we bring in detectives who talk about cases and how they've utilized victim advocates in their cases. They go through crisis intervention training. They go through communication skills training. So they get a whole background of information.
And so, why do you think it's important to have victims advocates at your police agency, at a prosecution level, probation? I mean, why do you think that's, an important piece to have?
Because even as a professional in this field, the whole system, the judicial system, is very confusing. I've been here 20 some years and it still confuses me at times. So imagine someone who's just been a victim of a crime and they don't know the process at all. Imagine how confusing that is to them. And so that's where we come in. We can explain to them step by step and kind of prepare them for what's going to happen. A lot of times detectives, they don't have time to do that. They're following up on cases. They're out on a homicide, they're out on this or that. They don't have time to answer all those questions. So that's where we can take the time and explain things step by step. We can go to court with victims. And what that does is it really keeps victims connected to their cases, and keeps them involved in the process.
And that would probably be, a question too, that people might not understand. So, you go on scene and, it could be very chaotic and there's a lot going on and, the officers, will have you in contact with primary victim or something to that extent. What are some of the questions or specifically, what have you seen specifically with victims when you're there with them? I mean, what are they asking you?
A lot of times it's kind of like what's going to happen now. Is the other party going to be arrested? Kind of what the next steps in the process are.
Does it seem like that, sometimes, that they're just maybe just not understanding because they're in trauma?
Yes,
And,
that's very common.
And when that does happen, I mean, there might be a tendency for them just to forget what's happened, or that they'll forget the information that you gave them. Is there a lot of follow up that you
We do.
provide?
We follow up, probably call them about 2 or 3 times afterwards. And we also give them our contact information, our email. We get their email, and we do a lot of follow up with them.
Do you find that information is probably the biggest thing that you're providing to victims at scene?
Information and resources too.
Like what kind of resources?
Let's say I'm at a domestic violence call and somebody, the perpetrator, let's say, broke down the door, and we can't just leave her with a broken door. So calling out those resources to come fix the door and helping her fill out the crime victim compensation so she doesn't have to pay for that. So we do a lot of resource referral as well. Resources for counseling.
And let's just talk about that for a moment, because there is a lot of emphasis on mental health right now, and that would probably be something that victims don't know a lot about, or they might not have access to it. How do you bring that up to somebody? Because mental health can be a very personal experience. How would you bring that up to a victim?
Sometimes I'll tell them, after something like this happens, it's very common to go through a whole range of emotions. I always let them know, don't think you're going crazy because, you're having all these emotions. Because a lot of times victims will say, I think I'm going crazy. This happened, that happened. And I let them know those are just normal reactions. What really helps a lot of people is seeking out counseling, and I let them know that there's resources that we can help them fill out so that they don't have to pay. We don't want them to incur any costs. And I also let them know that I think a lot of people, when they think of counseling, they think of, I have to sit on a couch and talk to a counselor. I let them know there's a lot of options out there these days.
Like what?
Like animal assisted therapy. There's you don't have to sit in an office. You can do it virtually if you feel more comfortable in your own setting. So there's so many different options out there. There's yoga. There's, I think there's therapy where they go up in the mountains and.
Oh, okay, yeah, because I've heard of those things like that, like art therapy that might be available, equine therapy, music therapy. I mean, there's just a lot of things that are available out there. When you do bridge that information, or you give that information to victims, I mean, what's their response? What do they think of it?
They're like, oh, I didn't know all those things existed. I just thought that you went in to talk to someone one-on-one.
Okay. And a lot of times too, whenever you are dealing specifically with victims, we talked about that, with the confusion, not understanding the process. What is your process whenever the case goes from a police investigation, but then they're not able to find the suspect? And kind of what happens at that point? I mean, what type of information can you provide to the victim if, the case hasn't resulted in an arrest yet?
We have a lot of safety measures we can put in effect. So we'll talk to them about protection orders. We also have funds that help with relocation. So we've done that for a lot of victims, relocating them. Like, let's say they have a family member in Arizona that is willing to have them come stay with them. We can look into relocation funds.
And in doing so, because you've talked a lot about those victims that are receptive to this information. How do you deal with those victims that just are uncooperative at the moment, but you're still dealing with them?
I always leave them my contact information, and we have resource information. We have what we call packets specific to different crimes, and I'll leave them that information because I know from experience of doing this a long time, they may not be receptive tonight, but you'd be surprised how many times, like maybe 4 days from now, I'll get a call from that same person and say, I just wasn't thinking that night. I didn't really know, it was overwhelming. But now that I'm looking at the information, I'm more open to what you have to offer. So
And so when you do that, I mean, internally, how do you feel when somebody's calling you and asking for this information?
it makes you feel good. It's like you think to yourself, I didn't think I was going to have any impact, but I did.
And so, it just sounds like, the work that you do is not only there on scene, but it's a lot of follow-up work, looking for those resources. I mean, what are some of the things that are just very difficult to find?
Housing. That's probably our number one is housing. Because shelters, I call every week and they're always full. And that's hard because you've got somebody who has nowhere to go and they're in a safety situation. And it's frustrating that we don't have enough housing.
And in doing so, when you're dealing with that, when you're trying to help somebody out and it's difficult to find that information, those resource services, I can presume that could be very stressful and hard on your mental health, just as a professional doing this work. I mean, how do you decompress it? Because, you see advocates, they see some pretty horrible things. They respond to everything from car crashes to homicide cases to domestic violence, child sexual assault cases. I mean, all those things, it seems like a very difficult to be on your mental health. How do you decompress with that? How do you and your other advocates work through that kind of stress?
Well, one of the things we always stress in our training is self-care. All of us have like little things we do for self-care. Probably one of the biggest things too is we have a great team of people. So if I've had a really hard call, I'll come back to the office and debrief with my team. So that's one of the first things I do. We check in on each other. If we see that someone had a hard call, we'll often check in with them. Hey, how are you doing? Do you need anything? And my self-care, like I love walking. So sometimes if I've gone on a hard call, I'll come home from work and head out to the park and walk around about 3 times.
And I think probably too, that's something that people don't realize is that, the work that you do going to a crime scene with all of the terrible things that you might be seeing at a crime scene. I mean, are there those things that, you just sometimes can't forget?
There are those cases. Usually the ones that stick with me are involving kids.
Sure.
That's probably one of the hardest calls for me is kids. And for me also is elder abuse. That's a big trigger for me as well.
Why do you think that? Because, I mean, a lot of people, unfortunately, while we do have laws against at-risk adults, to help at-risk adults, crimes against them, I mean, what do you see that's hard on you when you're dealing with a case like that?
Well, I think it's because they're so vulnerable and, think that somebody took advantage of that vulnerable person.
Do you see that a lot with especially with family members who took advantage of them?
Sons or daughters who
And
stole
so,
all their money
and so that would obviously, just be something. I mean, how would you deal with somebody like that? I mean, what type of advocacy would you be doing for that person for an at-risk adult crime?
just a lot of safety planning. Maybe, if they can't take care of themselves, maybe notifying like adult protection.
And that's good because a lot of people don't even realize that that's a resource out there is adult protection services.
And senior resource center as well.
What are some of the other, just going on that part right there, what are some of the other agencies that you work with specifically to those cases that you're dealing with?
We work a lot with like our local DA's office because a lot of times if it goes for like criminal prosecution, then we do like a soft handoff to them, kind of letting them know, who the family members are and who to contact and just kind of giving them a handoff so they are able to get in contact right away and
And
start
some
that
some
process.
other agencies that you work with locally?
We do a lot of nonprofits. There's for like sex assault victims, there's Blue Bench, there's Porch Light. That's a justice center that they built in Lakewood a few years ago. and it services all of Jefferson County. So a lot of our victims, we refer them there because they have a lot of wraparound services under one roof.
Good. And a lot of times too, it just feels like, again, we talked about that earlier, that victims, sometimes they do feel alone in the process because the criminal justice system can take a very long time for it to work. How do you deal with that with regards to just some of because you've been working in this field for a long time and you've seen where there are gaps in the system? I mean, how do you try to help the victim deal with that, help them understand that this might take a long time?
I always let them know it's not like you see on TV. It's not solved in, an hour.
Yeah, it's not solved in 40 minutes between.
But just letting them know that they always have a way to communicate with me. Mm-hmm. I'm there to answer any questions. And, I try to check in with them until I feel like they're at a point where they're feeling comfortable.
Mm-hmm. And just talking about that too, let's say, for instance, if you're dealing with a very terrible, case such as a homicide case, and, you're dealing with the survivors, and ultimately your officers, will arrest the suspect, but it might be months later. I mean, while there is that satisfaction that that this case is now moving forward. I mean, how do victims react to that? I mean, because obviously they've lost a loved one, and that's very traumatic in and of itself. But when you give that notification to the victim that the case has been solved, I mean, what is the range of reactions that they have? Because some people might be overjoyed, or some people might, just be very emotional about it.
As far as like homicides, a lot of times they're glad that it's finally, they have some type of answer and resolution. Mm-hmm. So a lot of them are happy, but they also know that then there's going to be like a long court process. So it's kind of like they're happy, but yet they know there's still a long ways to go.
And so that's when you do the handoff to the district attorney's office, to the victims advocates there. And
we also encourage them that, if we built a strong rapport with them, we let them know we are happy to go with you to any of these meetings with the DA's office or to court. Our role doesn't have to stop at that point. We can still attend court hearings with them.
Mm-hmm. Good. And I would probably say too, what do you want people to know about the work that you do? What do you want people to know about victims advocates at law enforcement, at the law enforcement agency level? What do you want them to know?
I want them to know that I think that advocates at every level have a huge impact, a positive impact. And we see like really positive outcomes. And I feel like advocates are so crucial. I don't think that law enforcement could do their cases without advocates. They wouldn't have as good of an outcome.
And I think too that's something that people, because the concept of victim advocacy is relatively new in the criminal justice system. And I think that's what's important about today's podcast is that the work that Hope and her team do at any law enforcement agency, sheriff's office, police agency, I think that's going to be really important, and to people to know that most, if not all, agencies, have victims advocates there. And I hope that today's podcast, has given folks a little bit of an understanding about that here. And that's what we're going to be closing with today. So I want to thank Hope for being here today with us. Very appreciative to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Randy.
Appreciate it. And this podcast, the Victim Advocate, Colorado Victim Advocate, we will be publishing this on Spotify, and we'll be publishing this as well on our YouTube channel, the Colorado Victim Advocate. So hopefully you'll be able to come and listen to it there. We want to thank you again for listening today.